For us. Obviously we know we've covered this before, but the story of the Bible is in Genesis chapter 1, we have God create the world. In chapter 3, humanity falls into sin. And then the rest of the scripture is really about how God selects a people and how He's trying to help them understand who He is and what He's about. And that's the Old Testament people of God. And then you have the incarnation of Christ, which is our little manger here. You have the incarnation of Christ, which is Jesus coming into the world in His ministry, and then His death and passion and resurrection. And then there's a new people of God. In the New Testament, you find this in Acts. And much of the New Testament is about trying to flesh out what it means to be the new people of God, where all of humanity is involved in it, not just the Jews from the Old Testament. And then at the end of time, we'll see the second coming of Christ. So where we're at today is part of the ministry and incarnation of Christ. So this is Matthew 24, 1 through 18. If anyone has that, I would love it if you would read it for us. Anyone who has a Bible? I have PowerPoint going, so I don't.
Jesus left the temple and was walking away when His disciples came up to Him to call His attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" He asked. "I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting at the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to Him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? And tell us what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age." Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginnings of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of his house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak."
Great. Okay, so the section starts off with Jesus saying, "See these stones?" I mean, you have to understand the temple was this big, massive structure that Herod had built. And so it's this big, massive structure. And it was an impressive job. It was the one thing that Herod did really to make the Jewish people like him. He was really not all that likable in general. But he tried to win them over by building this temple. And so they're walking past, and they're oogling and eyeing the temple. And Jesus says, "You see this? Not one stone will be left on top of each other." Then he explains the coming of the end. Now there's things about this we can't really get into a whole lot, because how much of what Jesus was saying happened during this Jewish war, and how much of it is yet to happen? That's a great theological question. I'm not sure that I'm equipped to give us right now. But certainly in Jesus' day, the first Jewish war would have felt like. It would have felt like what Jesus had said was coming true. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this first Jewish war. We're going to kind of put into a historical get our hands around it, so we can understand it. So we're going to review a little bit so we can get up to the war. Because everyone likes talking about a war, right? Kill people, hang them on a cross, yay, fun stuff. How did we get here? How did they end up in 66 AD? Well, it started off literally 300 years before Christ. Remember we talked about this. Hellenization and Hellenism. And the Jewish people and the Greek people, the Jews were trying to retain their identity in a culture that was swimming in Hellenism, right? We've talked about this. And it made it really difficult to maintain that Jewish identity in the midst of all this. So Hellenism is kind of the environment in which all of this is happening. And not just Hellenism, it's also the Roman Empire. You get Rome, you get Hellenism. It's kind of all happening together. And in the midst of this, you have a Jewish worldview. So the Jewish worldview kind of puts us there. And in the middle of this, overlapping in the middle of Judea, you have Pharisees, you have Sadducees, you have Herodians, and you have Zealots. This should all be familiar, right? This is all happening concurrently. What that means is it's all happening at the same time. Okay? The Pharisees and the Sadducees they're fighting with each other because Judaism isn't set up yet. What is modern day Judaism really gets its start after this war. Okay? So Judaism, which is really fascinating because they talk about how Christ came in the fullness of time. Judaism was not set yet because there's Phariseeism, which is what's going to become modern day Judaism. And then there's temple worship, and it's happening at the same time. So there's some Jews who are really into the temple, and some Jews are really into the law. And some Jews are really into being ethnically Jews, and some Jews are like, I'm Jewish, yes, just like that guy's Cyprian or that guy's. So it's a very fluid environment. Okay? In the middle of that comes Jesus. So if we're going to talk about the geopolitical times of Christ, what all of this leads up to is 70 AD. Okay? Geopolitically, in terms of the geopolitical times, the climax of history, quote unquote, is this war that erupts, that takes 300 years to build towards. And then the end result of this is there is no more Jews in Israel. They are minimized, they are spread out, they have lost their homeland, and in terms of history, that should have been the end of them, really. There should never have been another Jewish people ever again, because that's just what happens in history. You lose your homeland, people get spread out, that's usually the end. That's not what was the end, but it's usually what's the end. So 70 AD is what all of this is working towards. Jesus' life, his life and death is on the way. It is on the way to this geopolitical climax. That happens right around roughly a generation away from Christ. About 45 years after Christ is this great revolt. Now, I'm not saying that the centerpiece of history is 70 AD. What I'm saying is, if you're looking at it in a historical way, this political climax is kind of what people would say that's what it's moving towards. Jesus came at the right time to get himself killed. A guy in this process, heading towards this revolt, saying the things that Jesus is saying, and we've talked about this before, saying the things that he's saying, doing the things that he's doing, is going to get himself killed leading up to here. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about this. I want to get us to this world's climax, because this is what the Zealots were working towards. This is what the Sanhedrin was trying to prevent. What we're going to see, we're going to watch how this thing unfolds. We're going to see what the Pharisees saw, and they were like, we got to prevent this at all costs. Does this make sense? I hope. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the first Jewish war in 66 to 70 AD. There's a lot of names. I'm going to try to keep them to a minimum, but you can find this in Josephus' histories. He has a whole book, and he wrote, Josephus was a general for the Jews during this war. So he was a general. He's not just some guy sitting on the sidelines. He's a Jewish general, fights for the Jews in the northern area right around Galilee, just outside of Galilee. And he gets captured by Rome. And instead of getting killed and crucified, they keep him. And he becomes kind of a mouthpiece that says, hey, surrender, the Romans aren't that bad. But if they catch you, you don't want to get caught. That's kind of what Josephus does. Okay? So we have his tale. It's a very insider's tale of how this war came about. So, right around 66 AD, the war moves to an explosion. Now, what you have here is this Hellenistic culture. Rome was really sided. Who do you think Rome sided with? The Jewish believers? Not believers. The Jewish people or the Hellenistic Greek people? Right. They're going to end up leaning this way. Well, in a town called Caesarea Maritima, which is not too far, which is right on the coast, there's a group of Jews who are trying to get into their synagogue. And the Hellenists, which are Greeks, basically are harassing these Jews. They're making it difficult for them to be able to get into their synagogue. And the Jews are going, we just want to be able to get there and to worship. We just want to be able to worship God. And the Hellenists are just kind of sticking it to them. They raise the prices. They make it impossible for them to be able to expand. They make it very difficult for them to get to their synagogues. So then one day, some unknown Greek goes outside the synagogue and he offers a sacrifice of a bird. Turns over a bowl and he offers a sacrifice to his God of a bird right on the steps of the synagogue. You can imagine how this went, right? The Jews are kind of getting stuck to them. They're second-class citizens. They're not getting treated fairly. They're not getting treated rightly, so they start having problems. And this is kind of their homeland, but it's also not, like they're Caesarea Philippi or Caesarea Maritima. So they're right on the coast. Very, lots of cosmopolitan, lots of people moving in and out. Well, they start causing trouble. They start rioting. They send emissaries to the governor of the area, who is, let me make sure I get his name right here. It's Gallus Florius. Now, Gallus Florius, not a great guy. He had taken bribes, and he was basically all in with the Hellenists. So he's backing the Hellenists' play. So the Jews in Caesarea start rioting, start having problems. Rome sends in their guys, like, hey, you guys are the problems here, knock it off. No one's paying any attention to the birds that got sacrificed on a synagogue. This kind of begins to roll out even into Jerusalem. There's starting to be some trouble. Gallus sends troops into Jerusalem and takes about 17 talents, which is not a huge amount of money, but it's decent. 17 talents out of the temple treasury. He said it was for Caesar. Nobody believed that. So certainly Josephus didn't believe it. So the Jews, in response, there's a group of Jews in response, dress themselves up in rags, put a basket on their head, enough of them, and they go around saying that they're Gallus Phyllis and that he needs help. And obviously he's been impoverished. So can anyone possibly help him because he needs money? Sounds like a skit out of Saturday Night Live, right? It infuriates him. He sends troops into Jerusalem to exact revenge. Hey, who are these people? These are your troublemakers. We gotta ferret them out. So he sends troops into Jerusalem, and he's gonna ferret out who these people are. So he grabs some of the key leaders of the community. He says, if you don't find them, I'm gonna find them, and I'm gonna kill them. And this is all started because of a little bird sacrificed on the doorstep of a synagogue. He ends up rounding up people who belonged to the equestrian order, meaning they were Jews of high social standing. Pilate was of the equestrian order, just to give you guys some kind of a feeling for this. He rounds up Jews of the equestrian order and crucifies them. This just gets better and better. Now you can see in this context, who is Rome siding with? They're siding with the Greeks. And the Jews feel like they can't get a fair hearing. So they riot. They end up driving out the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, and the revolt is afoot. He ends up calling his superior out of Syria. Northern Syria he calls his superior, and they send in the 12th Legion. The 12th Legion, about 6,000 troops, so 5,000 legionnaires and about 1,000 auxiliary troops come down. And this is Rome, right? I mean, Rome comes in, they're going to move in, they're going to squash them. One legion of troops was able to really fend off a lot of troops because they were so disciplined. And they had, remember we talked about how their structure and their organization, and these guys were disciplined. So 6,000 troops should have been able to quell almost the entire revolt. Well, they get in Jerusalem and things just start falling apart. They can't take the city. They have to fall back because they thought they would take it quick, and ended up they were fortified. So they end up moving back to the sea, and they stop at a place called Beth Horon. This is not really a stop. It's more like a valley they had to move through. And it's got this gap here. And the Roman legions can't deploy in a full battle line because it's a valley. So the Jews line the valley on either side and using arrows and stones basically sling them to death. They wipe out the 12th Legion. The war has now gone from a mini revolt into a full-blown war where Rome has now lost 6,000 of her troops. The emperor is Nero. Nero is in Rome. He is the emperor at this time. He says, all right, we're done playing. It is now time to take this thing seriously. So it takes about a year. And they build up 60,000 troops. And they're going to come and they're going to squash the revolt. Questions at this time? How are we doing? I thought these pictures were excellent. They kind of help give an illustration of... Picture paints 1,000 words. This is the Jews defeating. Remember, this is a small, backwards... It's like sending the United States Army into Connecticut. And Connecticut beats them. That's kind of the image that we're kind of having. Or maybe sending them to Puerto Rico. Maybe, what was that? What was it, one in the 80s? Grenada. Remember we went Grenada? Imagine us sending troops in Grenada and having them all wiped out. What would America do after that?
Send more.
Right? Who are you to kill off the... So they raise up an army that's really not necessary, but it's pretty typical of Rome. Right?
Yeah.
60,000 troops get raised up, and Nero appoints a guy by the name of Vespasian. Isn't it crazy how a little thing, like someone's... I mean, can you imagine being that a Greek who sacrificed the bird outside of the synagogue? Right?
It's like, well, I mean, you can blame him because he was the spark, but like, there's just been gasoline building up in this place. Like,
Oh,
if
yes.
it didn't spark, it's something.
Yeah, he was just simply the last domino that fell before the whole thing blew up. So, yeah, but it's absolutely, like, this is all what's going on. This is the environment in which Jesus is coming into, guys. This is the political hotbed. This is the big gasoline fest that is Jerusalem, is Israel, during this time frame. So it's just waiting to happen, and the right thing happened, and they got the right guy, the right Roman guy, who was unwilling to bend, who was more than willing to crucify Jewish Roman citizens of the equestrian order, just willing to do it. And the Jews were willing to mock him and put the little, it's kind of like a Saturday Night Live skit, and yet that contributed to this whole thing. Well, Nero sends Vespasian.
Doesn't he later become an emperor?
He does become emperor, but you're ahead of time. You're ahead. Don't get ahead of us yet. We still have to go through the year of the 4 emperors. So Nero sends Vespasian. Vespasian ain't going to mess around. So he's going to take about 7 to 8 months to a year to raise an actual army. So what does that mean about Jerusalem? What does that mean about the Jews?
It's like pseudo-independent for them.
Yes, they're pretty much independent for this time frame. They're capturing, and this is what they do. It's like pandemonium. The Romans have lost. The gates have been unleashed. So you have groups like, what do you think the Zealots are doing?
Raising an army.
Yeah, they are prepping.
They are raiding. It's that whole country of Judea just becomes an explosive area. It's like bloody Kansas right before the Civil War. The Jews, the Zealots are unleashed, and so they're taking it out on anybody they can get their hands on. What has been constrained before by Roman might has just been unleashed. So they're murdering collaborators. They are murdering Hellenists. They're going to purge Jerusalem of all these non-Jewish elements. There's the Zealots, and these guys were pretty sold out on their view. Then there was the Sicarii. The Sicarii were Jews who thought the Zealots weren't radical enough for them. So one of the, Josephus actually talks about some of their practices is they would go into towns and they'd carry swords with them, and in the middle of a crowd they would find a collaborator, someone that they thought was a collaborator, or someone who might have possibly collaborated at one point, and they would come up behind them and stick them with the knife, slit their throats, and then run off into the crowd again. This is what the Sicarii were doing. So Israel at this time has kind of degenerated. It is a mess. And it's not just simply we're going to get rid of Rome. There's no centralized authority because no one is really taking charge of this. There's a guy named Menahem who tries to make himself the king. He tries to set himself up as the Messiah, but Eleazar, one of the high priest, basically says he is a tyrant. That's what Josephus says. And Menahem had become a tyrant, murdering people willy-nilly, saying he's the Messiah. He was a zealot. And he said, I'm the Messiah, and set himself up to be king. I mean, this is what we talked about before, right? This is the time when the king's going to come. Well, he thought he was the king. So he's killing anybody who disagrees with him. Eleazar, who is of the high priest, says, this is not the Messiah behavior. So he revolts against him and kills Menahem. This is Jerusalem during that time where Vespasian's raising his troops, training them, getting ready to ship them to Syria. And Jerusalem has degenerated into a slop heap of death. And that's what it is. It is a slop heap of death. The zealots are killing anybody they think might have collaborated. Anyone who's remotely in collaboration with Rome is being murdered, robbed, their stuff is being taken. And they're being, the whole place is degenerated into a big mess. Well, Vespasian, this is where he starts off at, is he lands in Caesarea in 67, and they're going to go, and they're going to take, anyone realize, what is this around here? Anyone have any idea?
The capital.
This is the Decapolis, but this is also Galilee. Okay? So he's going to Galilee, and he's basically, if you can see this is a pincher move. We're going to cut you off from your supplies. We're going to cut you off from Persia, which is where the Persian Empire was. Okay? We're cutting you off. That means all of this is free. Okay? He goes into Galilee, and the Jews, because of the situation in which they're in, lack of centralized leadership, lack of central authority, no one prepared for the destruction or the preservation of Galilee. Nobody really prepared for it. So when Vespasian comes in 70 AD, he captures and kills as many people as he can, because what does Rome do with this? This is what Rome does. Like, this is what we do. We're making an example. They're crucifying people. They're putting them on crosses. Okay? And he just murders a whole bunch. Well, it's war. So, I mean, he's killing thousands upon thousands of civilians who are Jews who are running around the Decapolis. Well, remember, the Jews have been murdering people in there too. So the Greeks are fleeing. The Jews are trying to mount a defense, but they didn't really prepare for it. So the Galilee gets taken over. And 100,000 Jews get murdered in Galilee alone. So the refugees, the people who make it out, head down to Jerusalem. And these are all, remember, the hotbed of revolt comes from Galilee. Galilee is really the hotbed, okay? Which is why Jesus was from there. Galilee is the hotbed of revolt. Jesus comes out of Galilee. This is not a hard thing to figure this out. They come to Jerusalem, and they flood into Jerusalem looking for refuge because, as you can see, he has kind of boxed them in. This is all mountainous range here, okay? It's kind of boxed them in. And then the really bad stuff starts to happen. The Jews, the Sicarii, and the Zealots, they don't get along with each other. Because the Sicarii say, you're just a bunch of pansies. You're not willing to kill everybody. The Sicarii are willing to kill anybody. Matter of fact, they take the high place called Masada. Part of their job was to take Masada. They took Masada and then came out of it a few months later and murdered 700 Jews. And they went back to Masada. This is the Sicarii, okay? The difference between them and thugs is not that different, okay? So they go to Jerusalem, and the city of Jerusalem itself erupts into civil war. Because the different groups who are vying for control of Jerusalem, who's going to run the government? Who's going to run Jerusalem before the Romans come? Josephus talks about, he says a couple of things. One of the things that he says is that there were so many dead bodies lying around Jerusalem before Rome even showed up. Before Rome even got there, there were dead bodies, unburied, lying in the sun, that the Zealots and the Sicarii had just killed. If you were wealthy, Josephus says, if you were wealthy, you could pay to get out of Jerusalem. If you were poor, they just killed you and left your body there. But you could bribe your way out, but you couldn't get out, because they thought anyone who's leaving is a traitor to Rome. I mean, you can kind of see how that mentality is going. You're going over to them, you're going to go help them, we're going to kill you. Oh, you've got 10,000 talents, well, we'll let you go. That's kind of how that worked. In some ways, they said that Titus, who eventually moves on to Jerusalem, did it out of compassion. He was like, we got to end this. Jerusalem had descended into an ugly, ugly place. And then an interesting thing happens, all right? As you can see, the campaign here of 78. Between, in 79, or 69, sorry, in 69, Nero dies, commits suicide. And then we have what's called the Year of the Four Emperors. Let me make sure I get the names right here. In about 1 year's time, Rome went through 4 different emperors and ended up in, I pushed the wrong button here. Here it is. Galba, Otho, Ventilius, and Vespasian. In 1 year's time, these are the emperors. It's called the Year of Four Emperors. So, just to kind of help you guys grasp the significance of this, okay? Octavian, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. That's all one family. It's the Julii family. They're all part of Augustus's line, called Julius Caesar. Okay? When Nero commits suicide, that is the end of the Julii line. That's the end of what Julius Caesar had started over a century and a half before. That's the end of his family. So that the empire itself descends into chaos, into civil war. For about a year between these two emperors who have raised their own armies and are murdering each other, trying to make themselves emperor. Finally, at the end, Vespasian, who's sitting on an already hardened army, a trained army, is able to go back to Rome and get himself established as emperor. And he kind of stops the year of the 4 emperors and says, and this starts what's called the Flavian dynasty. The Flavian dynasty only lasts to Nerva at the end of the century, so it lasts about 35 years. And it goes Vespasian, Titus, Domitian. Domitian is the youngest son of Vespasian. So Titus is sitting here while his father goes to Rome and takes over the empire. Finally, Titus begins to move on Jerusalem after his father has taken over control and been able to do things. So they then set up siege ramps around Jerusalem. Now this is just an artist's rendition of what it would have looked like. But they set up siege ramps around Jerusalem, and they're basically under siege for about 6 months to a year. Romans are building tall towers, tall assault things. This was considered the hardest war Rome ever fought. They said it themselves. This was the hardest war Rome ever fought. Kick out Carthage. Kick out the Greek Revolt. Kick out Gaul. They said the hardest war they ever fought was the war against the Jews. This was bloody and it was difficult, and they set up siege ramps all the way around it. And this is where it gets really crazy. Okay? Remember the Sicarii and the Zealots are in the city divided. They've divided it up into segments. It's not just Zealots. I mean, you have other groups who are in there. There's little areas. You don't go to that section. That's controlled by that group of people. Right? Well, they're trying to get all the people of Jerusalem engaged in the fight. So they had actually, one thing that the Jews had done well is they actually built up years of supplies of food inside Jerusalem. They were actually able to withstand a maybe 3, 4, 5 year siege by the Romans. someone, no one knows who, but they think it was the Sicarii, got the brilliant idea that if we burn all the food stores of the city, everybody will be motivated to stand on the walls and defend against the Romans. So the Jews burnt their own food stores in the city while the city's under siege. You can imagine what this is doing to the population. This is a city that's under siege now, and they're under siege for months, and now our own people has decided, you're not motivated enough, we're going to burn our food stores. So they burn the food stores, and that's where the Romans start moving in. Let's take a break here. How are we doing? Now we've kind of jumped through all this. What's this sound like to us here as we're going through?
You can see why, I mean, obviously Rome had its evil elements, but even like a good person in Rome could be like, wow, we really need to like establish order, like the kind of like American thing now is that, well, if we're the dominant power in the world and this is just chaos where people are just being slaughtered, like we have to reestablish control.
I feel like, oh, you're not motivated enough to fight the Romans? Well, we're going to burn the food. I feel like if I was like the average Jew in there, it's like, now I just want to kill you.
Exactly.
But they had already done enough of that. I mean, that's what was going on inside the city.
Yeah, like we're just kind of like, you know what, now I'm kind of almost ready to go into Rome. Like be like, you know what, you didn't burn our food. And
Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems like I've never heard of a time where someone was like, I'm going to conquer this place for your own good, and I've ever like fully bought into it, except for this. Like, yeah, you're kind of like, okay, Romans, come on in. You're not great, but better than this.
Better than the crazies that are in here with me.
Guys, this is what the people who sat in the Sanhedrin, they saw. They didn't see it all in detail.
Yeah.
But they saw something like this.
Yeah.
This is what they imagined would happen with a revolt against Rome, yes.
So, and killing some peasant carpenter with a small following, that's the price we have to pay to keep from Jerusalem being burned to the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what they would have said. Killing Jesus was to prevent this.
Right. How many of us, if we had seen something like this, would go, yeah, one guy against this doesn't sound bad.
He's kind of asking for it.
You see what I'm saying? It's really easy for us to look back on them and go, man, they're just a bunch of morons. They don't realize who Jesus is. This was the alternative that they thought they were facing. Clearly they didn't know it was going to get this bad. It got bad. But this is what they were thinking about was going to happen. You begin to see, man, I don't know that I would have done much different.
especially when you think about like a lot of them had families too. Like that's, you know, when you're trying to look out for your family or your community, you don't think about what the other people are doing. Like you just want to survive.
Well, yeah, and you can see why they thought those zealots are nutballs. They were nutcases.
Yeah.
And they're burning the food in the city and they're murdering anybody who's trying to get out. And they're coming out of Masada to murder an entire town of Jews. They're not even murdering Romans, they're murdering Jews. And then going back into Masada. That's crazy. I'm pausing so we can catch our breath. This kind of feels, it just kind of like one keeps rolling right. You think it can't get any worse than this, and this is, you just kind of keep on rolling.
And next week we're going to talk about Jesus.
But-
Jesus.
But you know, it struck me 2 weeks ago when you brought up the fact that, you know, so much we've all heard about the fact that Christ came in the fullness of time, but when you mentioned that there was that, was it a 10-year window when
Pilate.
Pilate was
there
directly in control of
directly
Jerusalem.
of Jerusalem, where it had to be that he came into that time within that 10-year window for him to be crucified. Because the fact that obviously it's only.
Yeah, the Jews would have stoned him.
Yeah, because the Jews would have stoned him. There wouldn't have been crucifixion, and there had already been, you know, the different prophecies that the Messiah would be on a cross. And, you know, and so it's just, there's so many times I think when we look at timing of things in our own life and we're like, why, Lord, why? Well, God's timing is so perfect. And, you know, and all of this just seems so crazy, and it is, and people are crazy, and the Sakari were crazy. You know, and clearly people do things that are not part of what the way that the Lord would want it done. However, he uses even the crazy ultimately for his glory and for his purposes. And, you know, and so even though all of this is just mind-boggling, how all of this could transpire and could take place, and
It's about a 6-year war.
yeah,
They take Masada in 73.
yeah,
So this is a 6-year war. This is not a small
little itty bitty thing.
Right.
But
So,
it was still used.
yeah, they ended up knocking down the walls of Jerusalem.
Was.
Right, absolutely. They ended up knocking down the walls of Jerusalem, and Rome has to fight their way in. The city just doesn't surrender.
No.
The zealots are not going to just give up. They are radicals, and they are holding their ground, and they fight them on the outsides of the city, and then they fight them on the insides of the city. And Rome has to make their way street by street by street through street fighting all the way up, and the zealots kept shrinking in and going to, anyone want to guess where they went? The temple.
Yep.
Temple's the center place. It's the highest place around. It's the thing you can easily miss. Everybody can't miss. Everyone keeps retreating to the temple, and it takes them several days to fight into the temple. This is the kind of street fighting that we're talking about here. Hand-to-hand combat, street fighting, people no longer have food. It's just pandemonium. And then they end up stopping them in the temple, just outside the temple. This is an artist's rendition, once again, of the fall of the temple. They get to the temple, and the zealots realize we're done. We're not going to be able to stop this anymore. So they set the temple on fire rather than let Rome have it. So they burned it. It wasn't because actually Titus and Josephus was telling them, stop, you can keep your temple. Stop, we will let this stop. You can have all these things, because there's lots of Jews outside of Jerusalem that wanted to keep the temple there. The zealots are like, no, we're going to fight until the end. And rather than let Rome have it, they burned it themselves. And according to the sources, the gold, it got so hot in there, the gold ran out of the temple, down the steps, and went in between the cracks of the stones. So by the time the Romans broke through and they started massacring all the people who were left in the temple, there just wasn't much anything left. And so what you end up with is they start looting the place. Anything that's not nailed down, the Romans take, because this is how war went in the ancient world. If I have to go all the way in, then you aren't getting any pity, and we're taking everything out. They ended up prying the stones away from each other to get the gold that had been running between the stones. So when Jesus said, not one stone will be standing, it wasn't a joke. That's why the Wailing Wall is all that's left. There was one wall that was left. They pried apart everything because they wanted to get the gold that was left. Then the group that hadn't fallen in Jerusalem was left in Masada, which is a temple of Herod. This doesn't really look all that great. It looks really pixelated. But this is a mountain in Israel called Masada. There's actually 2 palaces up here and kind of a pseudo-fortress. You can see here, this is actually the Roman base. And Jerusalem fell around 70. Masada fell in 73. What's that tell you? They kept fighting for a while. Here is the Roman base, and what this is right here, you can't really see it. This used to just be a valley. The Romans gathered up anybody that didn't murder, crucify, or enslave. They gathered up the surrounding population and turned them into slaves. And they built this entire ramp with slave labor. And it took them about a year to do it. They just took dirt and filled it in. And this is what Rome did. Like, this is how they operate. You're going to put yourself in an impregnable fortress? We're just going to build a ramp. And we're going to do it over a year. And that's what they did. They built up this entire ramp. The Roman army moved in. According to Josephus, not a lot of historians put stock in this, but Josephus says the people who were left on top all killed each other. There's about 700 people. They all killed each other. Rather than to fall in the Roman hand, they killed their own children. They killed their own wives. They murdered everybody rather than to have them fall into Roman hands. So when Rome got up there, according to Josephus, there was nobody left but dead bodies.
And when you go to Masada, that's the story that they have on all the plaques and everything.
Yeah. And that is the end of the Great Jewish War. Rome came back. Titus, this is called Titus's Arch. I've been there, I've actually seen it. It's not, the Colosseum is here. So here's the arch, here's the Colosseum. Titus came back and built this arch in his own triumph. You can see them carrying off the menorahs and the stuff out of the temple. This came back and built us the Colosseum. The Colosseum was constructed from the gold that they got out of the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. So, that is the first Jewish war, the Jewish Revolt from 6 AD to 73. What are our thoughts when we call it a day?
It makes sense both theologically and politically when Christians at this point started saying, okay, whatever we have the same history, but whatever that was, we're not on that path anymore. We've split ways.
Because there's another revolt that happens about 60 years later. It's called the Marcova Revolt in Egypt. It's just about as bad, not quite. What are our other thoughts on this? What does this do with our understanding of Jesus?
Peace is radical. Turning the other cheek is radical.
Yep. When the high priest Ananias says, "Don't you realize it's better for one man to perish than that the whole nation perish?" He wasn't just speaking hyperbole. This is what everybody was trying to avoid. All of those Pharisees, Sadducees, they were trying to avoid this. The Zealots were looking for this. Radically crazed looking for this. They thought God was going to break in and save them. Your thoughts?
I just felt stressed throughout the whole lesson.
That's why I paused. I'm like letting us catch our breath because it's like the hints just keep coming.
How would they distinguish this from the future end times? Like that probably was the end times to them, right?
Well, you can see why everybody would have thought this is the end of the world, because you don't just take, it's not just this revolt, you have the year of the 4 emperors. It's happening all at the same time. And so for a solid year, there's fighting not just in Jerusalem, there's fighting everywhere.
People claiming to be the Messiah.
Well, in Jerusalem, yes, but in the rest of the Roman Empire, there's people claiming to be the emperor. So it would have felt much like the end of the world. I don't doubt that for a second. There were probably a lot of Christians who were like, this is it! This is it! He's coming! Let's go out and wait in the field! Because it's a coming. Because that year of the 4 emperors plus the Jewish Revolt, plus all these things that are happening, it would have felt like the end of the world. We really don't have much on. 9/11 was bad, but it wasn't like this. Next week, we're going to start a 4-week lesson on the Gospels. We're going to talk about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We're going to look at how they interpreted Jesus. So we're going to look at Matthew's vision, look at Mark's vision, look at Luke's vision, and look at John's vision. We're going to discuss how they present Jesus to us. That's kind of wrapping all of this up. All right? And then we'll be done. That'll be the end of the semester. So we'll go on to a different topic. So let's pray. Father, we are grateful for this day. We're grateful for your people. Lord, we are saddened and sickened and in awe of history as we listen to these stories. Lord, we have to realize how close we are to this ourselves. Help us to be people who live peacefully and with grace and forgiveness, because we don't want to be living in that world. We thank you, God, for all you've given us. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right.
How did their soldiers train? Because they were machines. They just started pulling bricks apart to grab gold and...
Well, they're big
Got all
bricks.
the way into
this big, they were
I
just
feel like
small.
all that fighting and they still wanted to haul off all too, and it just seems like a lot of work.
Well, they built the Coliseum with it, so.